Oh, look at that. Rocking the AirPods.
Well, now I have them.
Are you recording everything?
Yeah,
you got new ones.
Recording. Yeah, I got new ones, yeah.
You basically spent like thousands of dollars at the Apple Store and got nothing new.
Yeah, I don't want to think about it. It's been an unlucky Apple month here, but it'll be okay. A couple months actually. It's worth it though. I called the hotel in New Orleans and see if they found anything in it's got to be my room, but I haven't heard back yet, so I'm not holding my breath.
There's zero chance. No, I say that a lot. I think hotel staff is extremely nice about that. I don't think they steal stuff. I think a guest though, they get the room after you might.
Yeah. All right, welcome back to Front End First. This is a podcast about web development, mostly focused on the front end, but who knows? One of these days we'll have an episode on database indexes. We'll just have to wait and see. We'll never have an episode on database indexes. Is it indexes or indices? See, that tells you everything you need to know about how much I love back end from development. My name's Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And today we're going to be talking about the Headless UI doc site that we built, I guess at this point, 2 months ago?
Yeah, early April.
Nice. Hide self view, again, hot tip, the old hot Zoom tip. And and then we have some hot tweets that we're going to talk about at the end. But let's get right into it, man. We got to work with Adam Wathen and Steve Sugar and everyone else at the Tailwind Labs team, and to build out one of our favorite types of projects, which is a doc site. Feels like over the years we've built a lot of those. But this was a really interesting project for a few reasons, so that's kind of what we want to talk about today. Even though it was a doc site for like an open source project, it was run like a client project, right? I
mean, of course, like we were hired to build the website,
Right. But like a lot of times with these kinds of things, they're not really, scoped out. They're not, don't have features that are prioritized and things that are deprioritized and cut because of, wanting to ship on a deadline. There's a lot of times not a professional designer who's built out the screens for all breakpoints. So it was fun because it's just, serving developers is always fun because we're developers and we like that. But also being given the space and time to kind of do it correctly was, it was a really rewarding project. And, compared to some other stuff we worked on in the past, they're a small team. They're good at shipping. And so it felt good to just have it done basically in like 2.5 weeks, I think, from start to finish. We just wanted to talk about that today.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Like we had a deadline imposed by them, and it was really good. It's just really good to have a deadline. Even though it was like it was self-imposed. Was it self-imposed? I don't know. But it was
self-imposed by then. It wasn't external. There was no conference coming up that they didn't control,
Exactly. And which was awesome because it actually got us to quickly discuss scope, cut stuff, prioritize, all the things you just said.
Right.
But that was really good. I think a lot of teams, especially if you're in charge, you might say like, well, we can push it back a week. And there were a million times where Adam could have said that, but he didn't.
Right.
The dude had a baby during the
right, and even that didn't change the deadline.
Exactly. So, and it was really, it was really, really good. It was good to just target something, prioritize, and be done and proud when we were done.
Yeah, I think that's worth talking about just a little bit more in case there are folks out there who haven't worked this way. You and I met working at a conference company, so when you're working on something like that, where you have a date that everyone's flying to Vancouver for, that is a natural deadline that will impose this discipline on the team, and you're forced to make those decisions. And it can be really uncomfortable at times because everyone wants to do their best work, and I think a lot of us in tech can be perfectionists, and that can, slow you down. It can stop you from shipping, but there's definitely a tension there. But the deadlines, if you follow kind of I think the Basecamp methodology of Shape Up has been the latest version that's kind of crystallized this thinking about software. You either kind of have like this deadline with flexible scope or fixed scope with flexible deadline. But even if you think about how Apple does it, like Apple has events every 3 times a year. And if something's not ready, even if they advertise it like that charging pad thing, they don't ship it. So that's an example of cutting scope and sticking to the deadline. That's kind of what the Basecamp folks talked about in that book. That's what Adam and the team do. That's what a lot of people we know working kind of in this area do. And yeah, it's just an interesting way to think about it. Because I think, again, like you said, we've worked with places with a fixed deadline. We work with places that have slipped. I mean, I think most developers have worked on projects or teams where you think something's going to be done by June of whatever, and then a year later you're still working on it. 6 months later you're still working on it, and everyone's like, why is software so hard to estimate, and why do we always go over time and over budget? And this is kind of one way to push against that. So how'd you, I remember you having an interesting kind of insight, like, or just a reaction, like either after the beginning of the project or sometime through, where you were just kind of like, it wasn't really uncomfortable. Did you feel like that?
Oh, yeah. No, not at all. I did not feel uncomfortable at all.
With like being restricted and having to cut things.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were a few times we spiked on features like interactive demos. And, I may have spent like a day or half a day coding it and building out a few, and then just being like, these don't look good. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough time to like fully design these and build these all out, given that there's only, 2 weeks left. And so it was just like, we're going to cut this. And that's so much better than working on it for like 5 more days and then being like, hey guys, these actually don't look that great.
And then like either feeling the pressure of staying up super late to finish it because you want to deliver on a promise, which is easy to do, or having all that sunk cost and throwing away even more work.
Also, too, just to kind of echo something what you said, I think some teams that I've been a part of, when deadlines were chosen, they were more just like optimistic, feel-good dates that no one, including the developers, just no one on the team really put a lot of thought into. Just like, oh, we want to have this stuff done by Q3 of next year. And it's just like, what? Like, okay, sure. And then, next year rolls around, and like you said, you're still working on it. So just having like, this is going to be done in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's awesome. It's right. Everyone gets to think about it. It's top of mind. It really forces you to prioritize.
Forces you to take on a chunk of work that is actually feasible. The whole team knew we could ship a doc site in that amount of time, even if it was just what was the API docs that were on the GitHub README into a website form, right? Mm-hmm. And then we had stretch goals, like, the demos, like the hero demos, which we got, the interactive demos for each code example, which we didn't get, a version selector, which we didn't do, the grid lines with the gradients, which we did do. So there were all those different things where you can kind of bail out at any time, but you can still ship truly a MVP that satisfies like the project goals. But yeah, it does take someone, who's good about committing to that and willing to drop the scope hammer and willing to say no to things. I mean, there's a lot you had to say no to, and you have to be okay with that. But I think it gets better with practice, and I think saying it up front with everyone is good too. So yeah, it was a good example of it. And, I think there was a few. I mean, I remember at the beginning, I did want to keep going with the interactive examples for each code sample, but it was absolutely the right decision not to do that because there was plenty of work else to do, and it turned out to be, the right move. We got to spend more time making the code samples look better and the highlighting and all those little design details that Steve put into it, and so I think it looked a lot better and ended up much better, And then again, like always, once you ship it and people start using it, they still haven't done that, which means there's all the other stuff that's way more important because people start using it and they say, oh, how do I do this? Oh, there's a missing example here. Oh, this is out of date. And now you're working on the stuff that your users really care about instead of what you thought was most important before you shipped it.
Yeah. Yep.
which is also just such an important point and part of the reason why it's so good to ship earlier and often and get feedback from, the actual users of whatever you're building. So
yeah. Sorry, I like having a delayed reaction to that. I was just working with someone that was pulling code off the Tailwind doc site. And I remember when we were building it, there was like an API that we were arguing about how to word it, how to include it in the docs. And watching him copy and paste the code off the doc site, put it in a component, and how it ended up in a PR and what everything was named. I was like, wow, this would have been really helpful for like when we were discussing how to do these docs. So that's just like, yeah, just seeing someone else use a website is it's just one of the most important things. So like, great point about a deadline is you have a date that you can work towards to get to that, to get to real users. Yeah.
Right. Cause again, like you could have, all 6 of us in a room sitting there talking forever about what's the most important. As soon as everyone's going to agree. As soon as they see someone go through that process, they're going to say, "Oh wait, we none of this matters anymore. We need to work on this other thing." Hopefully it wasn't too embarrassing when you watched him go through. It was okay.
No, it wasn't at all. But I was like, oh wow, this is exactly what I remember from building the doc site and just seeing it. How it ended up from the doc site to in a real world code base was just.
No, you're absolutely right, because dude, the day it was launched, that person put out that YouTube video. Remember where they went through and built a switch, and they put it out like within an hour of using it. But they having no context at all of anything that we were doing. We've been thinking about this stuff forever. We understood why it was headless and why you have to do work to make it styled, so it doesn't all the things that are the details about it. I was watching him have kind of a hard time getting it to do what he wanted to do. Some things didn't quite make sense. I was like, man, if I had seen this, maybe I would have written this a little bit differently. Maybe I would have had a different example that would have been easier. So it just goes back to the point, right?
Yeah. You would have added a section that was like how to make a YouTube tutorial.
Yeah, exactly. Here's how to make it look incredibly easy. No, that's
cool.
A really, really interesting point.
Do you want to explain like what is Headless UI and what the goals of this project were?
Absolutely, because, this just happened to be a project we worked on, but it's also relevant, I think, to anyone listening to this if you haven't used it yet, because if you're a front-end developer, I think it's a great library. So just like we have inputs in the browser that let you enter text, but with some tweaking, you can use CSS to style them to fit any look and feel of your app. That's great, right? Well, when it comes to things like select boxes, we don't have that. So the select box has this native UI, and sometimes people want to make it look like their app. They can't, so they end up doing all this work to make it something that looks like a select, but it's really hard to do that because there's a lot of functionality built into the native inputs. And then there's inputs that don't even exist natively in the browser, things like modal dialog. So Headless UI is an attempt to build these components and expose them as React and Vue components in a way that lets you act as if the browser did provide you a modal component, a drop-down component, a list box component, but they're completely unopinionated about the styling. They just provide you with the functionality and the accessibility pieces, and then you get to go to town to style it to match your app. So turns out there's a lot of accessibility requirements with things like this to make sure things work if you're tabbing through a form, to make sure things work if you're using a screen reader, arrow keys on tabs, things like that, arrow keys to navigate list items in a drop down, focus control on a modal and locking the scroll on the body in the background, focus trapping, all of those things that come and are expected, and the things that make your app feel broken if you do them wrong. That's the point of this library, basically. And the APIs are designed with styling them yourself using Tailwind in mind, but they are actually able to be styled with any styling technique. So that's where the headless part comes from.
Yeah. Tailwind UI, which is their product that they sell, has a bunch of pre-built components, and a lot of them are, higher fidelity modals and alerts. Pre-styled. And so because it's something like a modal, it needs a little more than just HTML, right? It needs JavaScript to, events to open and close it. And so Headless UI is a way.
Yeah, Headless UI is a way for them to basically give you the fully designed pieces that are in Tailwind UI that rely on more than just HTML and CSS. That's really that's a good point, because that's the motivation for it originally, is like making sure we can offer in Tailwind UI things like notifications or, confirmation dialogues that are styled really nicely, but that you have control over how and when they open and close, all the programmatic access. And so instead of building them into Tailwind UI, the product, they build the lower layer, expose it in this open source library that anyone can use for free, and then build on top of that in their product. So it reminds me of back in our kind of when we were working with Ember, the rationalizing the primitives keynote that Yehuda gave one year, where he was talking about how Ember was like this higher level stuff built on top of the rendering engine. And then I think they were working on Glimmer at the time, and they said we need to rationalize the primitive layer. And then the higher level stuff is what a lot of people use, but the lower level stuff should make sense for that layer of abstractions. That's kind of how I think about Headless UI.
Nice. And
it's cool because, it works in any React app or any Vue app. So we've been using it on this new project, even though we're not using the Tailwind UI stuff, or the style of the app looks very different. It's a super awesome library. I would use it even if I wasn't using Tailwind. If I was coming to a project and I was using something else and needed a modal dialogue, that's how I would do it, because it's just a nice API to work with, and so it's really cool. So something else I wanted to talk about on this project was the design side, because we had basically full designs and in Figma for all of the breakpoints. And we've worked on projects with that before, but cool thing about this is we were working with the Tailwind team and the folks who created Tailwind. And so there was a few tips we picked up with just working, how to work as effectively as possible. Basically, how the creators of Tailwind think about kind of design, dev, handoff, And even the handoff part is like, I've never super liked that. Even kind of going back to our conversation last week, there's always feedback that goes back and forth, and there's a lot of times you work together. But I think there's a few things we picked up from how Steve works in Figma to make it easy as possible for the developers, and then also kind of vice versa, how Adam or some of the other folks would look at the Figma and then bring it into the browser. So I guess the first thing I remember was just how all of the values in the Figma file were effectively the same values in the Tailwind config. So I think they were working with the defaults, but this would apply even if you had customized your config. So Steve had named actually set up a custom color palette inside of the Figma file, and named them. There's a way you can name them in Figma where you say like green/800, green/700. Then when you go to choose them, it kind of groups all of them together. So if you were working on the design side in Figma, you could just go to choose a color, and you're just choosing from the same colors that the developer has. And I thought this was just like a really cool little example of, it's always frustrating if I've been on the design side before. You design something, someone builds it, and it's not quite right. You have to go back and nitpick or show them or say, hey, this is off. And then on the developer side, like you want to implement the design as close to the mock-up as possible. But if it's really hard, it can be frustrating. You're like, why the designer make this thing 1 pixels and this thing 2 pixels? I just want to put padding of 4 around the whole thing. It's just, and then you start to say,
why is the spacing 17 pixels? You always,
exactly. And was that intentional? Do I need to make it perfect like that? Or was that just because they moved it around and kept it in a certain way? And I don't need to actually do that. You want to make your code maintainable. You have all those cross-cutting concerns. So I think their process is cool because it's come out of, their work on first the refactoring UI stuff, which is kind of about design developers and thinking like, actually, when we do watch designers work, a lot of times they are moving stuff around, and a few pixels here or there is not, those choices aren't like we have to get those into the final form. Also, there's constraints and breakpoints and everything. So all that influenced their process. And so, I don't know about you, but I found it like when I went to build a page, not only were the colors pre-selected from Tailwind, even the spacing scale was. So I think Steve had updated his Figma defaults. When you nudge with like shift it nudges by 10 pixels. And Tailwind defaults to a 4-pixel spacing scale, which can be changed, but most people I'm guessing use a default, and they also have arguments as to why you should use a 4-pixel spacing scale on the website, which is basically it divides evenly and it goes into 16 evenly as well, which is the base font size. So it kind of just works out for things like inputs and text and all. It's just there's a reason it's a default. It's like the best choice, or there's arguments as to why most of the time it's the best choice. So I think Steve makes his default nudge 4 pixels, and so when he's spacing things out, it's all divided by 4. And in Figma, you can just hold Option, mouse over an element, and you can just see, oh, this is 12 pixels and 16. So I just go PX4, PY5, And I don't know about you, but I hadn't really done that as much as I did until that project.
Oh my God, that was 100%. And it was like if the HTML page I'm building isn't pixel perfect, I'm definitely like something's way off. It's not like, oh yeah, that's like close enough. It was like I'm zooming in, I'm measuring, definitely using the what do you call it when you hold Option and see the lines?
Like the guides or whatever, the rulers.
Okay, using those all the time.
Yeah.
You get really quick at doing the divide by 4.
Yes.
Math.
Yeah. But you could. I also used a lot like Shift-0, put Figma in 100%, and then have it next to the screen, and it should look exactly the same. You know, and obviously this team in particular cares a lot about polish, so you knew like they were going to want to see it. There's no reason for it not to be exactly the same. In fact, that's the fastest, easiest way to build it. So it should be exactly the same.
Dude, even like if you're a designer and you're like, why don't my developers ever build things how I design them?
Yeah.
Like, this is a way where I'm telling you, like, if it didn't look exactly like the Figma file, like I knew I was doing something wrong. And so I would go out of my way to like, seriously, like zoom in, like why, like even like the little, like the radius is off here.
Right.
And like rounded edges.
That was the other thing. Shadows, radiuses were all bound to the Tailwind values. So you knew if it was rounded small, rounded medium, you didn't have to guess, the shadows, everything like that. I mean, it's almost like you just want to see the classes, like the class list right there and just grab them. But yeah, it's really powerful. And I think it's kind of like, it's almost like that abstraction point of the Tailwind scale values is just so nice as a way for the designers and developers to talk to each other. I don't know how those shadows are created with the 5 layers. I mean, I read about it once, but I'm not thinking about that when I'm implementing the design. But now I can just see it, look at the value in the sidebar, and just and implement it like so easily. So it's really powerful. I mean, it's really fast, really powerful, and like you said, it benefits both sides of both parties. Dude,
it totally changes. It like flips a bit in your head where it's not this is good enough to, it makes it like, why isn't this perfect?
It's almost like you have a spec file and that you're fulfilling the spec file and testing in the same way that it's like, if this piece of code is working because you've gotten all the tests passing. Now, that this thing looks exactly the same and it's really cool.
Yep.
So everything from the spacing values to the shadows to the radius, I think this is, if you do ever do design and you're listening to this, and you are working with Tailwind, I think it also works if you're working with other design systems. But the fact that you can name all those things, and it forces you, when you're as a designer, to constrain yourself to those values, it's going to make everyone's life so much easier,
Yep. I just want to make this point again. Like, if you don't have those constraints and you're designing and you have, multiple frames in artboards in Figma, what do you call them? Frames, right? Each page would be a frame. And they both have like, let's say like they have a modal or an alert, and they're 2 different heights or 2 different widths. The developer's just gonna shrug, and they might ask you, but
there's 1,000 things like that come up. They can't ask you every little question.
Yeah, so you're just gonna shrug and pick the one that you as a developer think is right. But that we're not designers. I don't trust. Definitely don't trust my choice there. So just knowing that everything matches this Tailwind file it's so powerful.
Yeah, no, that's good. And it's just pleasant and fun to see your implementation work look as good as the designer's Figma file does, Mm-hmm. I guess the last thing we'll say about the design is I think Tailwind like 2.1 or 2.3 or 4, I don't remember. There was some minor release of Tailwind that had just happened, and they added support for like the backdrop filter stuff. And seeing Steve work was really cool because there's times where that was one other thing I wanted to say was there was times where instead of keeping it, the Figma file was great for 90% of the work. There were some times where, especially when it came to like designing all the different states, hover states, focus states, which were all very intentional, partly because the project is a focus on accessibility, but also because it wanted the hero demos to look really polished. We would just jump on a call together and go through all those together. And it was easier than doing it in Figma. And I just thought that was interesting. It's just really efficient, fast way to work if the designer and developer can just do that from time to time, Yeah. And it also changes sometimes too, just like we were talking about last week. Sometimes when you actually build it and use it, the designer says like, I actually want to see this work a little bit differently. But yeah, back to the Tailwind feature with the backdrop filters we were trying to figure out how to do like the floating header treatment. We were trying to figure out how to do, there's a drop down menu and then there's a mobile menu, and the backdrop filters let you do this nice background opacity, blur effect. And it's kind of like the iOS frosted glass. Like if you pull down the control center on your phone, it kind of blurs the background a little bit. Yeah, it just looks like that frosted glass look. And it turned out to be really easy. So we used that a couple different times. So if you're looking for a cool effect that you can just have in your back pocket, I definitely recommend checking out. If you just go to headlessui.dev, you'll see it. Let's see where you see it right now. Click on the first component and start scrolling the header on desktop, and let's see on mobile what happens. It's actually both. As you scroll, the contents are behind it, but it's pretty cool when you see like the white headings behind it. And then if you pull down the React View drop-down menu, you'll see the background is kind of this frosted glass look as well. So, these icons. I mean, again, the design's just really cool. It's like this dark theme, so it's just fun to build. There's lots of little cool details with the text. There's like a little shadow on the inset of the code. The typography is really well done. It uses the Tailwind typography plugin, which is it's complicated styling arbitrary markdown, but it does a pretty dang good job. I mean, it makes it look really good, especially out of the box, and you can tweak it. And once you get it working, it's just great because it just makes every page look really good. So yeah, that was anything else on the technical side that we want to talk about? I mean, we had worked with
I got some stuff.
Okay.
Oh yeah. It was a Next.js app, which first time building a doc site in Next. I think a few times before we had used Gatsby. And so I guess like one thing is like I know in the past we've done episodes that like compare Next to Gatsby, but I never realized like how much Gatsby is doing for you with its plugins. So when you're writing like Markdown or MDX or whatever, Gatsby has just a ton of plugins that they wrote. Things that do like source code highlighting, and like source code highlighting is actually really like, it's really, really hard. It seems like it should be easy, but turns out it's really hard. All this stuff that Gatsby gives you. And so at one point I was like, man, like Gatsby gives you so much stuff. Like, should we just be using that? Because reinventing the real?
Right. They have the whole content mesh thing so that the plugins have a way to communicate between each other, whereas Next doesn't really have that notion.
Yeah, I mean, not like just like syntax highlighting. There's so much you have to know about.
Yeah.
You don't want to do it on the client because it's really expensive. You want to keep it on the server. The like whole like line highlights when you syntax highlight, that's like not actually like built into the syntax highlighter. That's like code that you write that injects HTML in there. So, Gatsby's basically has written a plugin that gives you all that stuff for free. You can look at like Dan Abramoff's blog and all that stuff. He like the styling of his his syntax highlighting, all those line heights, all those line highlights. That's all stuff that like Gatsby wrote that you get. So at one point I was like, why not, I really like Next, and I'm going to just kind of always default to using Next. But at one point I was like, wow, did we like underestimate what Gatsby gives us out of the box? I wouldn't want to switch to Gatsby. I think Gatsby has some other problems, but yeah, it just made me realize
aware of that.
Yeah, it made me realize, I think in the past when we had compared Next to Gatsby, I don't think I was considering all these things.
Right. And we had a lot of code to crib from the tailwindcss.com repo. And if we hadn't, it would have been a lot more work.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So this is where, so Next just says like, they have a Next MDX plugin. We're going to transform your MDX files into pages, and you can register remark plugins. I think you can do like rehype and remark, where the team was just more familiar with remark, and us having used neither before, went with remark.
Right.
And so you have to build up all of these things like table of contents, layouts, code highlighting. But you actually really get to, like, once you learn the tools to do that, it's actually really easy. I don't want to say really easy, but it's really like, oh, I know exactly how to pull data out of an MDX file and transform it. So it was good. It was like really good to have that experience.
You don't have to learn all of like these kind of other APIs because you're just working with the NPM packages. You're not working with like Gatsby plugins that are wrapping the NPM packages.
Exactly. There's like a super clean handoff boundary between like, okay, I know what Next is responsible for, I know what MDX is responsible for, and I know what I'm responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
Where with Gatsby, although they're giving you all that stuff for free, it's just case in point, like before doing this project, I didn't realize what Gatsby was doing,
right?
What MDX was doing. And it's all just kind of like this magical plugin layer. And I think you can make them, both of them, you can make look good. I think, like I said, Dan Abramoff's blog, I think is great.
Right.
I think it looks beautiful. So it's, I don't think like technically one is better than the other. I would prefer the Next stuff just because of the clean boundaries, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yep.
And the remark stuff is awesome. I mean, we got to do some really wild stuff like embed examples. So we could embed a Vue example into a React app and it would actually execute the Vue example.
Yeah. Yes. So this was going back to the spike that we did where we want to be able to write code examples in line in a markdown document with like GitHub flavored markdown code fences, have tick, tick, tick Vue, and then have it render the code example with syntax highlighting, and also above it, put the demo. So we had done something similar in Ember CLI add-on docs, which was nice. And that way you kind of know your code samples work. And you could even write tests against your docs to make sure if you're showing how to use transition that it works. And so it's kind of a nice way to keep that in check. But so that was pretty cool that we were able to do that.
And we do that if you go to like the Vue docs and you interact with the demos. That's all Vue code that's running.
Mm-hmm. Even though it's a React app.
Even though it's a React app. And you, as a developer, you're just writing the Vue component, and then you're importing it into an MDX file and rendering it. So
yeah,
again, these
MDX,
are like these are the things that when you have to understand that boundary, like that, it's like you can kind of unlock these things.
Right.
There's so much you can do here.
Right.
It's awesome.
It is cool. The MDX stuff is awesome. I mean, it continues to really impress me, and I really like working with it every time we work with it.
Yeah.
Lets you make really nice APIs. We made MDX components for these component API tables down here where we document the props and the slot props for everything. Customize the styling there. That was another little trick we learned. If you do use the Tailwind typography plugin, sometimes you want to escape. So when we were writing the demos, and the demos were in line, we wanted style demos, but the styles from the markdown container were leaking in because it was a child of like your markdown wrapper. And there's no way to like escape parent styles in CSS or HTML or whatever. And so we picked up this trick from, I think, the Tailwind CSS repo, which is when you would render an MDX component, we used, remark to insert a closing div beforehand so that it closed out the block that had the markdown class, which is how the Tailwind typography plugin works. It just uses like descendant selectors within a markdown div to style everything. And then renders your component and then appends a new div with the markdown class at the end. So that's a really cool way to like pancake in some unstyled content that's not going to get affected by the markdown style. So that's another little cool tip.
Yeah, basically like close the parent div, insert a sibling, and then reopen the parent div.
Right.
It's awesome. I mean, it's just so cool.
And it's not elegant way to solve the problem.
Yeah, and these once you
not elegant, but like it's practical and it works great. You know.
Yeah. Once you learn how to write like one or two of these, just that's it. Like all the future ones will just flow. It's like you understand how to like what the tree that MDX is providing you with, how you can transform it, how you can, inject your own JSX or HTML in there. So it's really awesome. Like getting practice with these is awesome.
Pays dividends. Yep.
I think so. I haven't been able to capitalize on that yet. We haven't done a doc site since, but so many ideas.
Yeah. I was just going to pull up really quick headlessui.dev and see remark with pros, with layout, with examples, with next links.
Yeah.
As another example, you can go to the remark plugins we ended up with in this project were with pros, which is the typography stuff, with layout, with examples, which is what we were just talking about, with next links. So that's another example of a remark plugin, just an idea where you could basically take any URL that is in a markdown link. So markdown does the square brackets and then the parentheses with a link. If the link starts with slash, so if it's a relative link, you can replace the component that's rendering it with a next link so that it's a client rendered client routing app as opposed to an A tag. So again, just, lots of examples, lots of ideas there you could do to improve the sort of setup with remark plugins.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. What else is on your list?
This was our first time using JIT in Tailwind, which was, it's so funny because now I feel like I've been using JIT forever and I'm a master with JIT, but this was the first project that we used it on, and it's really good. Like it is an amazing experience. So what JIT lets you do is it lets you write, the Tailwind classes that you're used to, but instead of using their scale, you can provide an arbitrary value, and then that CSS will be basically that CSS class will be created on the fly, and your HTML tag can use it. So one area where this was really helpful was with the grid stuff. We use a grid in a few places, like on the homepage, and those grid boxes, they're just arbitrary pixels, pixel values, and so there's no Tailwind scale that they fit into. But just being able to have that JIT escape hatch where I can say, okay, this is going to be a grid that has cells that are like 230 pixels and then 19 pixels and 230 pixels with like 1 pixel gaps. It was awesome. It was really, really powerful.
And it works with the responsive prefixes and the, as well as all of the variants in Tailwind. So you made this grid like change on responsive breakpoints and all that stuff worked with the JIT enabled, the JIT mode enabled. Also, we never had to configure variants in the Tailwind config because when you have JIT mode, that stuff just works automatically. And the file size is I guess, you don't have to run purge CSS either. So that's nice too, because it saves that time in your build step. And it's just fast as well. So no reason not to use it at this point. I think it's enabled by default by now. But yeah, it's true. When we were working on this, it had kind of just come out and was still getting established. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, strong recommend if you haven't used it.
One thing I was thinking would be cool. This is more on the IntelliSense side, but you know how you were saying you look at those pixel values in Figma, because like really at the end of the day, we're digital designers. A lot of us thinking pixels. I mean, we're always thinking pixels. Tailwind scale has this scale between the spacing scale in particular and the pixel value in the design because it constrains you. But I was thinking it'd be cool how if you could do something like, let's say you have a button with like 14 pixels horizontal padding and 12, 16 pixel vertical horizontal padding and 12 pixel horizontal, or vice versa, whatever. Anyways, you need 16 pixels. So you go in your head, 16 divided by 4 is 4. So you do px4. What if you could do px tilde 16 pixels and then you just hit like tab or something and it just changes it to px4?
Oh.
What if you could do like px dash like tilde 15 pixels or like max width tilde 350 pixels and it just changes it to max width medium? That'd be pretty cool.
It like finds the closest
one. It finds
one.
the nearest value within the scale. So you don't have to do that translation. There's this tool called Tint that basically does something similar for color, where if you're building something and you just want to stick with the Tailwind defaults, it can find the closest one. But I was thinking, why not with the rest of the values? And I guess that is more of an IntelliSense thing, but it's a similar idea.
It's so funny you say that because I'm working with designs for a project right now that were not designed against Tailwind. They just weren't. No reason why it should be. And so, but I'm using Tailwind to implement them. And so what I do is I bring up the, is it Headwind? What is the thing that gives you like the drop down that lets you select everything?
Yeah, I think that's like I think that's the VS Code Tailwind IntelliSense plugin from the Tailwind Labs people. I think Headwind does this shuffling.
Okay. So I bring up the IntelliSense plugin and then I literally arrow through. Yeah, and I find the one that's closest to the pixel. Like
RGB 109. Oh, that's the screen or whatever.
Yeah, there's some for like height and width where I'm like finding the width, and I know I need to make it like. And the designers that I'm working with on this project, they're not pixel perfect. It's basically in the spirit of this design. So I just find the thing in Tailwind that's closest to it.
Right.
So it's I would love that tilde because then I wouldn't have to
do the translation
through a list. Yeah.
Yep. Anything else on the technical side here?
I just wanted to just mention this pain that I felt with SVGs, importing SVGs.
You did something cool with this one.
Yeah. So you import an SVG and you use it in like a nav. So you have like, whatever, some icon and you're rendering in a nav and you're using like React's, or Webpack's SVGR, which lets you turn an SVG file into a React component. So you can just import it and render it. And it works perfectly. And then you go and you start to implement, either your mobile or your desktop design. And you use that same SVG in like, let's say the desktop version of the nav. And you do, you hide the mobile nav. And so all of a sudden that SVG disappears from your desktop.
It's so confusing. There's no errors.
Like, what is going on? Yeah, no errors. And sometimes it doesn't all disappear.
Sometimes the background disappears. The color doesn't work. The gradient doesn't work.
And so what's happening is when you export an SVG, they end up with IDs, like literal like IDs in the SVG, and there'll be things like gradients.
HTML attributes. The same way you put an ID on an H1.
Yep. And the reason they use those IDs is there'll be things like gradients and filters that target them. So if you have a gradient, oftentimes that gradient will be expressed in like a definition with an ID, and then the SVG will use that ID to get access to that gradient. And so when you've hidden your mobile nav, you've basically said that this ID is hidden, so it doesn't show up. Does that sound right?
But it's still in the page. Well, like let's say,
it's
so
still
if you
in the
use
page,
like if you use block and then medium hidden, it's whether it's display none. I think it's display none, right? But it's still in the page. Like if you view the source, it's still there. It's just not visible.
It's not visible
with CSS, but it's still rendered in the page.
Right, but I think because it's not visible means the gradient doesn't show up because it's in a div. It's defined in a div that's now hidden.
No, I think the problem is you have the same you have like an SVG that has like a path element, and then it has a defs element with like filter ID1 or filter URL #1, and it's pointing to the path element, which has an ID1. And then you render that again. And so actually you have two SVGs in the DOM at the same time, two defs sections with filters that all pointing to the same thing. And the DOM is like, all right, well, we're just going to put it to 1, which is like the first one it finds or whatever. So then the second one just doesn't get it, because you can't, it's not valid to have two elements with the same ID, but it doesn't break your app. It just gracefully fails.
I think though it's because we should test this, but I think it's because
I don't think it has anything to do with the CSS visibility. Because I think even if you had, I think we should test it. I'm not 100% confident, but I'm pretty sure I've seen this before. Regardless, like you could just have two icons, the same icons, rendered twice, and you could get things that mess up.
I thought I had to. Okay, we got to test.
I could be wrong, but yeah. Anyways, that is the root of the problem, is that the things don't have like hashed IDs. They have the same IDs. It would be like, an analogy would be like having a label in a form with like the for prop pointing to email, and you have that in two places. So then it's like, what am I supposed to do when I click the label? Do I focus the first email input or the second one?
Yeah. So one, it's just it's really hard.
Yeah.
So one solution here is like a lot of times when you like export these things from a design tool, the like ID will be like something like gradient 1 or like 1. And so one of the solutions here is that, and then all those, like if you have multiple gradients, they obviously all clash, and now you don't even know which one you're getting because they're all clashing.
Right.
One of the solutions here is that, okay, when we come across an SVG, we're going to find all its IDs, and we're going to give it a unique ID that's based on the file name. So therefore, if you have two files and they both have like gradient 1, well, by the time they get imported, go through Webpack and get rendered on your page, it's like one is, menu icon gradient 1, and the other is list box icon gradient 1. Mm-hmm. So that solves two different SVGs clashing with each other. But now when you're back to the other problem of when you're rendering the same SVG in multiple parts of the page, and that same SVG is going to have things that clash with it because like one is hidden, one is shown. You really need a way to give them two different IDs. Basically, every time you import an SVG, you basically need the ID to be unique per import.
I think you'd really want it to be unique per render, so you could import it once and use it in multiple places. Because that's how like a lot of input components work, where you render an input, it generates an ID per instance rendered, and then does it. And I think you should be able to do that because SVGs are React components, right? Or React elements.
Yeah. So there are folks that recommend that. The problem is it's painful because you basically turn your SVG into a React component, and there are tools out there that do that. You literally like paste in an SVG and it spits out a React component that you can copy. But then you've got to go through that React component, find all the IDs, add a prop onto them, and like, with me, I'm not like designing these SVGs. Someone else is designing them in Figma. So I just want to copy them right out of Figma.
You want no translation, manual translation from the source to when you render it in case there's an update or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think people have different preferences here, but that's my preference. And the SVGR stuff, SVGR Webpack, makes it really easy to basically just drop an SVG in some folder and just import it into a React component.
So what did you do to solve this?
Yeah, so I tried a whole bunch of stuff, but the thing I ended up with is a Webpack loader that basically you can use query strings when you import something in Webpack. And so I should go look at the code for this, but there's like a Webpack loader where you apply a query string to the SVG that you're importing, and you can give that a unique name. So if I'm importing an SVG to use in the mobile nav, I basically have a mobile nav component, and then I'm importing menu icon from, let's say, icons menu.svg, and then I'll do ? mobile. And then that that string right there will end up in the ID of the SVG. And then so if I have a desktop nav,
nice.
I have a different import, and I'll do like $desktop or $1 or no question mark, because the mobile has a question mark covered. And that
so the import string is used as like a hash, effectively.
Yes, an identifier. Yep.
Identifier, yeah. Nice.
Yep. Man, that was painful. I tried to do something where like in the Webpack build script, every time I encountered an SVG, I would basically increment a number by 1.
Yeah.
And so I could use that to give every SVG unique ID. The only problem is that my server renders were getting like 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, yeah.
And then my client renders were getting 4, 5, 6. And then I get
and they weren't matching, so you get that error.
Yeah, your initial render doesn't match the server. And then there's a way where you can like tease this apart, and you can like know when you're encountering a server import versus a client import. And it just, dude,
this is like this is where the camera goes to a montage, and Ryan's sitting there at 3:30 in the morning, babying one arm, a cup of coffee in the other. His eyes are like looking like insane.
Yeah, it's exactly what it was. And then you're on, dude, it's so bad, man. You're on GitHub. There's these issues. There's these issues that are like, they have like 400 replies. You know when you're in a GitHub issue and you're scrolling, and then there's like that little squiggly, and it says show 199
hidden replies,
hidden comments, and you're just like, oh no.
Yeah.
And then
I just hit at that point. I just hit the end button, and then it goes bottom. And it's like, why is this 3 years later and it still hasn't been fixed? I'm like, oh god. This is usually when I message you, actually. I'm like, Ryan, this would be a good one for you to take on. You want to work on this?
Dude, like some of these maintainers are just, they'll say like, you should tell your designers not to use gradients like this because it's a really bad practice. And I'm like, oh, okay. Gosh. Okay, let me go to Steve and tell him that he's not designing stuff well.
Right.
So
no, that's crazy. If anyone has good answers here, I'd love to hear them, because there's no way in hell you'll ever catch me writing a Webpack loader to start. I would copy and paste the file first and call it something else.
I think I was doing that at one point. I had like icon 2, icon 1. Yeah, it was just dark.
Yeah. I saw this funny tweet today. It was like, Scar developer with one word. All-star time zones.
Yeah.
You can just say SVG. That'll do it. That's a Scar right there.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, why don't we wrap up, speaking of Twitter, with some of our tweets of the week. And we just wanted to start talking about fun tweets we come across. I thought these were pretty interesting. We talk about testing a lot, and I happened to see both of these within like 2 days of each other. So first was this great little thread from Jeffrey Way, who is in the Laravel community and does teaching on Laracasts. And he said, it's a testament to how poor a job the testing evangelists have done that, quote, you should write tests, unquote, is still a debate. The tests in this screenshot help me sleep better at night. Why on earth would I not want to write them? And he has a screenshot here of a Cypress spec with like sign up, loads a sign up page, redirects authenticated users, displays an error if the card is declined, registers a user, user stories, basically high level tests, the kind of stuff that we talk about a lot on this podcast and the kind of stuff that we write, like we're writing in our consulting project right now. He says, I think the problem is that so many people were introduced to testing through best practice isolated unit tests that were littered with mocks. They quickly found that it didn't fill them with any sense of confidence and abandoned them entirely. When the correct entry point, in my opinion, is let's automate the testing that you already do manually. Then once you're fully comfortable, you can drop down a few levels when you need to. So I just love that whole phrasing, because that's, I think, how we think about tests. That's certainly how I think about it, and the most value I've gotten from testing over the years has been that kind of thing. I've done some. Mirage has a lot of unit and lower level, not even unit, but maybe lower level tests that are testing APIs that are not public, so they're not user stories from that sense, because the user story in Mirage's case is what the developers are doing with it. But they were to help me because I encountered a point in, let's say, the ORM logic where it was so hard thinking about all the scenarios that I reached for the test as a tool to help me design and code the logic correctly. And the test helped me do that and made sure that it didn't break in the future as I worked on it. So that's always how I've thought about testing. I never think about it as like a eat your broccolis thing. I always use it as a tool to help me. And I always start at the highest level possible. So that's the first tweet. And then the second tweet is Gary Bernhardt, which says, React encourages app logic inside UI code, making app logic units difficult or impossible to exercise. With no accessible logic, React devs redefined or rejected, quote, unit test. Then they rejected the testing pyramid based on that. But it's not about testing. It's about React. So that's interesting. It's kind of coming at it from an opposite angle almost. And he's saying it's, what the subtext here is like the testing pyramid is good. Unit testing is good. And also he's picking on React here, but the same was true of Ember. We, have things coupled in. It's any UI stuff. We did the same kind of approach to testing in Ember. And, I feel like the testing pyramid is something that I learned about early on, but I always have been in the UI space for the most part and always kind of approached it outside in. So, what do you think about these two tweets?
They're good. I mean, the Jeffrey Way one is awesome. There's like, I don't even have to think about it. I just, as you're reading, I'm just nodding along and smiling. Mm-hmm. It's awesome. You should, if your tests don't help you sleep better at night, that's a great little like nugget.
Yes.
The Gary one is interesting. I still don't know how I feel about that. Like I've definitely worked in Rails apps where you have a bunch of models and they all have to interface with each other. And it's really good to write, I'm just going to say unit tests, but mm-hmm. that low level, mm-hmm. Unit tests where you're testing a specific method on one model, and it gives you a lot of confidence when it works. I kind of think like who's like the end user of this thing, and for the UIs, it's like it's always a user. It's always a user. So I think it's right to reject the testing pyramid when you're working on UIs. I don't know. I don't know how Gary would respond to that.
It's interesting. I think it also, I think part of this, in the same way, my experience with Mirage has a bunch of low level, more unit tests around the ORM because that's the most complicated part of it. You can imagine a piece of software, let's say like a budgeting software, which has a lot of pages, but then it has some really complicated stuff. And if people were just doing the high level tests to stress every possible case there, that would be a pain in the butt, and we wouldn't do that either. Or every possible error state of a form, you wouldn't do everything. But if the error states were complex enough that you wanted test coverage around them, you might drop down a level and write tests for those validations. Let's say there was some complex business logic there.
It's so interesting because like if you think about a system where you do that, you would probably move all that app logic out of the UI layer, mm-hmm. right? So you'd have like a whole bunch of functions mm-hmm. or classes that you create that can basically, like, let's go with accounting software. They can like give you all your accounting numbers, like in the sense like outside of UI, right? They're mm-hmm. like their interface, the API would just be a bunch of, whatever, JavaScript calls.
Yep.
So in that case, you're moving it out of the UI,
which
I think what Gary's
supports Gary's point.
Yeah,
and he's saying Gary's saying that
if you don't move them out of the UI, then like the UI is your interface,
right?
And so that's what you want to test, and then the jump there is huge because you're going from JavaScript functions to all of a sudden typing in an input or clicking a button,
right? Yeah. I honestly don't feel like I have a huge pain point here. I know we've worked together on apps where we've done that, where we have a utils folder that starts up and then it maybe becomes a folder for, more domain related things. So, you have like, let's say you had a budget and maybe, in the Ember days, we'd make a class with methods, and we would be able to new up a budget and calculate its balance or calculate if it is complete or whatever. And we have tests covering just the business logic of some complex object in the system. And then you inject it or whatever, and the UI ends up being something that you don't have a ton of edge cases that you're testing, because it's really just more of a dumb presenter of the business argument of the logic. But I think to embrace that completely and say that we should do that all the time gets rid of a lot of the benefits of this stuff. Also, you eventually do have logic in the UI. If you don't at all, then it's like you're kind of kidding yourself, because you're going to be doing some sort of transforms in the UI at some point. So
this is a thing, like the Rails architecture. If you're following like Rails best practices, you have experience with Rails, you're nudged towards writing business logic code that can be invoked from anywhere. It can be invoked from the console. It can be invoked from a controller. Now, they're not nudging you towards this because you would invoke it from both places, but that is the MVC paradigm pushes more business logic into the model, has nothing to do with presentation, and basically can be invoked from anywhere. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of good things that come out of this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's really conducive to unit testing. Mm-hmm. The React model is like, look, we need to be reactive. Like we need to be reactive. We need to re-render. And in that case, you're pushed towards writing logic inside of React components. And that's
interesting. I was almost thinking that, like, I totally get your point, and the way you phrased it makes it seem like they're at odds with each other or kind of different sides of the spectrum. I was almost thinking of what if you took Gary's perspective to the logical conclusion and you pulled out all of your business logic into kind of isolated testable units that had nothing to do, no knowledge of how they were being presented, right? That's the idea. That they don't have any coupling directly to the UI. No, but that would be the equivalent of the Rails service-oriented stuff, which is what the same arguments people were making there, which is like, even though you're encouraged to have fat models in Rails, it's still coupled to your application. It knows it's part of a request response lifecycle. So in that sense, it is coupled to the display. I know it's decoupled from the view, which makes it usable outside of it. But it is coupled to your Rails application. Whereas if you go with the extreme nth degree of this, not the service oriented, sorry, that's the wrong word, the hexagonal architecture. Yeah. They're saying almost what he's saying, which is your budget or your budget class shouldn't even know it's part of a Rails app. And that way,
they would say it shouldn't even know it has a database. I mean, it's ridiculous,
right? I mean, yeah, but that does make it more testable. But it also, by removing the coupling, puts more burden on you when you do integrate it back together. So there's a spectrum here, right? There's a spectrum here, which is how I feel about it. Which is why I actually don't take a dogmatic perspective, and I think to start, if you want to counter in a UI and you want to increase it when you click it, the first thing you should do is write that in the simplest way to do that is to couple all of it together, because it is coupled at that point. And it doesn't bother me.
Let's use something though that has to be reactive. Like let's use like you're reacting to time or you're reacting to mouse movement. Like that is stuff that like you want that in React, because that's the stuff that React is really, really good at. Like you want a component that's going to like use mouse position or something like that. You don't want to extract that out into another thing, because then
what's the point? Why are you even using it to begin with?
Yeah. I also think it's like, I don't know, like if we view React as like a programming language, which I don't know if we're supposed to, but like, what do we end up just reinventing all the reactive stuff outside of React? What's the point?
Right.
So, yeah, I think I'm just thinking of like what I've noticed when testing Rails apps versus testing React apps. And that's a big thing where like the React app needs to be reactive, needs to change as the user interacts with it. And that's stuff that I want React to handle. I don't want to.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, maybe we'll have more to say about it next week. We were saving this for the end here, and I got to run. But of course, we should know better than to start a conversation about
this.
Testing, and I think we're going to just have 5 minutes worth of stuff to say. And we could sit here, I think, for the next 2 hours and talk about this. But this is really interesting. So, we'll make sure to link these in the show notes. And I hope you enjoyed some of those details about Headless UI. It's an awesome project, even if you don't use Tailwind at all, or you don't use Tailwind UI at all. I really recommend checking it out. It's maintained by their team, which is a company as well. So that's something I really like about it, because it's has that staying power. And if you have anything to say about the site, let us know. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and hope you all are having a great week. And we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.